In today's video, we'll be looking at the Japanese destroyer Hibiki, one of only a few Japanese destroyers to survive the conflict in the Pacific. This already makes her special because that force suffered terrible losses. Hibiki didn't entirely avoid that either. The ship took some severe damage during her service, yet she survived in the end, earning various nicknames in the process, with Phoenix being probably the most famous. This survival was a double-edged sword, however. Hibiki would survive the Pacific conflict, only to end up a war prize in the Soviet Union. Details on her service with the Soviets are sparse, but it is clear that she was eventually sunk, where the wreck became a popular diving spot. Let's look at how she got there in this video. That story began on February 21st, 1930, when Hibiki was laid down by the Maizuru Naval Arsenal. She would then be launched on June 16th, 1932, and commissioned on March 31st of 1933. Nothing particularly notable to this point, although you will see Hibiki cited as the first all-welded warship in Japanese service. As I covered in my Ryuho video, this is also applied to Taige. Make of that what you will. In any event, there were some quirks to this design. Hibiki was a member of the Akatsuki-class destroyers, which I'm doing my best on pronunciation, but Japanese will always throw me off. Anyway, exactly how you classify these ships varies based on who you ask. A completely new class or a subclass of the Fubukis. If you take the latter option, that makes them the third group, after the original Fubuki and the Ayanami class, or subclass. The reason this is a question is a big design change on Akatsuki, that being the boilers. Fubuki-class ships, including Ayanami, had 4 boilers. Akatsuki, meanwhile, had 3. These were a more powerful model, allowing for the same power as the earlier ships, but with 1 less boiler. The change in boilers also led to a change in silhouette. The destroyer retained 2 funnels, but the forward funnel was notably smaller and slimmer. This is the easiest way to tell an Akatsuki from a Fubuki or an Ayanami. There were also changes made to the bridge as well. A larger structure with an added level for fire control. The final notable change came with the torpedo tubes, which were given splinter-proof protection for reloading. Those 3 changes were the main differences. Beyond that, Hibiki was broadly the same as the earlier Fubuki, from tonnage to equipment. The tonnage came out to 1,680 tons on the standard loading, at least as designed. Modifications made early on increased this to 1,980 at the normal loading. On that displacement, Hibiki carried the same weapons as Fubuki, 3 twin gun mounts, 1 on the bow and a super-firing pair on the stern. These each carried 2 127mm or 5-inch guns, for a total of 6 barrels. The mounts were also technically dual-purpose with high elevation angles. However, the guns were slow firing and the mounts slow turning, so their actual utility in that role was questionable, to put it lightly. Meanwhile, dedicated anti-aircraft defense came with 2 twin 13mm machine guns, 4 barrels in all. These would later be replaced by the usual 25mm guns. Hibiki ended the war with 4 triple, 1 twin, and 20 single mounts, for a total of 34 25mm guns. Although warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy cites a smaller number of 28. That said, the real punch came from the torpedoes. 3 triple mounts carried amidships, 1 between the funnels, and the other 2 between the aft funnel and the stern guns. A total of 9 tubes in all. Weaponry was rounded off by 18 depth charges. Which brings us to the final design note in the ship's speed. 38 knots on 50,000 shaft horsepower, through 2 shafts. With that finishing off the design, we can now look at Hibiki's service. Unfortunately, there's not much to cover on the pre-war career. As I said earlier, the ship commissioned on March 31st, 1933. However, very little has been written on her interwar service, or at least very little in English. Even Combined Fleet only starts with 1941. Regardless, there are 2 things to note here. First, the 4th Fleet incident. I've covered this before, but the short version is the Japanese pulling a Halsey. During training in September 1935, the 4th Fleet was caught in a typhoon. This caused severe damage to several ships, including, in something relevant to this video, 2 Fubukis, or 1 Fubuki and 1 Ayanami at any rate. Hatsuyuki and Yugiri lost their bows. This exposed design flaws in the Japanese fleet, mostly in relation to overweight and structurally weak ships. As a result, all of the special type destroyers, Fubuki, Ayanami, and Akatsuki, went in for refit. This saw the bridge and funnels lowered, as well as extra ballast fitted. The ships also lost most of their torpedo reloads, going down from a full 9 to just 3 for the center launcher. This all increased displacement to around 2,000 tons, depending on the ship, and reduced the speed to around 34 knots. Still plenty fast, but definitely slower. The second detail, meanwhile, came later on, and that was Hibiki helping to escort USS Astoria on April 17th of 1939. The cruiser was carrying the ashes of Hiroshi Saito, the former ambassador to the United States. Hibiki helped bring Astoria into dock in Japan, alongside other Japanese warships. After that was over, the ship probably shifted to training duty for the rest of the interwar period, along with the odd service off the Chinese coast. So let's move to the Pacific War. Hibiki began this as part of Destroyer Division 6 with her sister ships, Akatsuki, Inazuma, and Ikazuki. These 4 destroyers would spend much of the early war together, beginning with sailing to support the invasion of Malaya and the Philippines. From December 1941 through March 1942, this was Hibiki's main role. She would escort both Japanese warships and transports, sailing from the Philippines to Palau, and from the Dutch East Indies to French Indochina. All of this work kept the ship busy, but there was little real excitement during this period. Hibiki, for better or worse, missed the battles in the East Indies. She didn't even participate in the Indian Ocean raid, because the ship escorted a convoy to Japan in March 1942, before going into refit into early April. After this refit was done, Hibiki moved from the warm South Pacific to the cold North Pacific, in this case to support the invasion of the Aleutian Islands. This, of course, meant that Hibiki missed the Battle of Midway. Instead, she was operating off Kiska Island as the Japanese made their landings. This would not mean that Hibiki would miss combat. The ship was attacked on June 12th by a group of PBY Catalinas. The seaplanes didn't land any direct hits, according to Combined Fleet, but they did make near misses, close enough to damage Hibiki's bow and force the ship home for repair, possibly towed by Akatsuki. I've also seen reference to B-24s being involved in the bombing, and at least one direct hit as well, but this seems to come from Japanese language sources. If anyone has more info there, by all means let me know. Either way, the bow was removed in dock on June 27th, and replaced with a false bow, before Hibiki then continued on to Japan for proper repair work. She would be in repairs from July 12th through October 10th. This would also lead to Hibiki missing the early battles off Guadalcanal. In fact, she would miss all of those actions, because even after the ship came out of refit, she spent the rest of 1942 on various convoy escorts, from November through December 1942, meaning she wasn't present when Akatsuki was sunk off Guadalcanal on November 13th. In fact, Hibiki would spend much of the war on similar duty. After another refit in January 1943, she spent February through April on convoy runs to Truk. There would then be a short break in May where she returned to the Aleutians. While there, the destroyer would take up patrol duty, before eventually helping the evacuation of Kiska in July 1943. After that, Hibiki would spend her time bouncing to every corner of the Japanese Empire. This period was mostly uneventful, as Hibiki stayed away from the active combat, and by some miracle or another, mostly avoided the ever-increasing submarine threat. You can see her as lucky in that regard. This period would run from September 1943 through April 1944. The most exciting moment probably coming on December 21st, 1943, when Hibiki helped rescue survivors from a torpedoed tanker. Otherwise, nothing much of note. Until she went in for another overhaul on April 10th, 1944. This was an extensive refit that saw a turret removed and replaced by two triple 25mm gun mounts, along with the fitting of radar. It didn't turn her into an anti-aircraft ship, but you can see the logic. The Japanese needed defense from air attack more than surface engagements. When this refit concluded, Hibiki joined her remaining sister ship, Inazuma, on an escort run. This began on May 3rd, 1944, and would see Inazuma torpedoed and sunk by USS Bonefish on May 14th. Hibiki picked up 125 survivors before continuing on. She was now the sole survivor of her class, with Destroyer Division 6 disbanded on June 10th. Soon after that happened, Hibiki was present for the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th. During this, she was part of the escort for the supply force, and as a result, mostly missed the action, aside from some strafing from American aircraft. With the failure of that operation, Hibiki returned to escort duty. However, only for a couple months this time, from the end of June through early September 1944. Because on September 6th, Hibiki would suffer her second set of bow damage. While helping a sinking freighter, the ship suffered a massive explosion on her bow. This would nearly sever it, leaving the bow slumping forward at a sharp angle. Exactly what caused this explosion is a subject for debate. The general consensus is a torpedo from an American submarine. Some sources will dispute this, however, and say the ship struck a mine. Regardless, Hibiki was forced to return home. After emergency repairs in Formosa, the ship arrived back in Japan on November 16th. Because of this damage, she missed the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. As a result, Hibiki spent the rest of the war around Japan. Her repairs concluded by the end of January 1945, after which she trained and patrolled around the home islands, with no indication she was going to leave the area. Although there is some debate on if the ship was intended to join Operation 10 Go in April 1945. This would likely have seen her sunk, or at least severely damaged. It wouldn't happen because of more damage. Hibiki struck a mine on March 29th, 1945, and had to put in for more repairs. As such, she missed 10 Go. Instead, the ship remained on guard duty for the rest of the war. She wasn't damaged during the various air raids on the home islands, and remained one of a handful of intact ships at the end of the war in August. This could have gone two ways at this point. The ship could have been scrapped or expended as a target, or as it turned out, she could be a war prize. Hibiki was handed over to the Soviet Union in April of 1947, renamed Verny and put into Soviet service. There's some argument on how that service went. Details are understandably sparse. Either way, the ship was renamed again to Dekabrist in 1948, and ultimately sunk in shallow water sometime in the 1970s. A sad end for what many consider a lucky ship. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.